Hello, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the Green Growth Knowledge Platforms webinar on green growth indicators and the Sustainable Development Goals. My name is Benjamin Simmons and I serve as the head of the GGKP Secretariat. Before we begin today's webinar, I'd like to provide a few words of introduction. The GGKP was established in 2012 just by the Global Green Growth Institute, the OECD, the United Nations Environment Program, and the World Bank. Since that time, the GGKP has expanded considerably and now reflects a global partnership of over 40 leading international organizations, research institutes, and think tanks. These partners share a common belief that mobilizing a green economy transition requires that policymakers, practitioners, and experts have access to cutting-edge knowledge and data to support their efforts. With this mandate in mind, the GGKP focuses on two main sets of activities with our partner institutions to identify and address major knowledge gaps in green growth theory and practice, and today's webinar will discuss some of the work emanating from this effort. And the second is to identify, gather, and share knowledge and data at the nexus of economic development and environmental sustainability with this growing community of practice. As part of these activities, the GGKP hosts a green growth webinar series. Today's webinar will focus on a recently released GGKP working paper entitled Measuring Inclusive Green Growth at the Country Level, and provide an opportunity to discuss opportunities for improving the way we measure our progress towards an inclusive green economy and the implications this has for measuring achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. Before introducing our moderator for today's event, I'd like to highlight a few logistical issues. First, we strongly encourage participants to raise questions to the speakers throughout the webinar. This can be done by typing your question into the chat box, which can be found on the right-hand side of the webinar dashboard. Your questions will then be submitted to our technical staff, who will then repost them to all of the participants for our panelists to address during the Q&A period. We will also be circulating a survey after the webinar concludes, and I would encourage you to complete it, as this provides us with important feedback to help shape our future webinars. Finally, if you have any technical issues with the webinar, please email us at contact@ggkp.org, and we will help you to troubleshoot. Now, without further delay, I would like to introduce our moderator for today's webinar, Dr. Carlo Carraro. Carlo will be well known to many of you. He is a professor of environmental economics and econometrics at Ca' Foscati University of Venice, where he served as president from 2009 to 2014. He also serves as vice chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Working Group 3. He is a director of the Climate Change and Sustainable Development Program at FEAM and director of the International Center for Climate Governance. Recently, Carlo was also elected the president-elect for the European Association of Environmental and Resource Economists. And finally, and most importantly, from the GGKP perspective, Carlo serves as the co-chair of our advisory committee. And so we feel quite fortunate to have Carlo moderating today's webinar. Carlo, it is now my great pleasure to turn this webinar moderation over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you very much. Let me start by thanking the audience of this seminar. We have 500 registered participants, which is quite a successful and remarkable number of participants, probably because the topic of this side event is quite relevant for many of us, and also because the speakers of the seminar, the webinar, are important contributors to this issue of measurement of Sustainable Development Goals. Let me thank GGKP for having organized the webinar. The webinar series organized by GGKP is very effective, very productive. We have been able to cover a wide range of topics, and I'm happy to see many of you coming back, many of those who are now listening coming back seminar or webinar by webinar to attend this form of sharing knowledge. And as you heard, sharing knowledge is one of the major objectives of GGKP. Third, let me introduce the topic and the speakers of the webinar. The topic is, as I said, an important one. In 2017, the UN Assembly has approved the new Sustainable Development Goals, quite different from the previous Millennium Goals. I mean, certainly a larger number of goals, broader in scope, broader in contents. We have 17 Sustainable Development Goals with respect to the 7 previous Millennium Goals, covering a wide range of topics, both on the environmental dimension, but also on the social and it's important to give directions to governments who should define policies and measures to guide growth, economic growth towards sustainability, and the goals are designed to achieve at least more sustainability by 2030, to guide this process through a set of well-defined goals. But given the goals, of course, we need indicators to measure these goals. Without measurement, there is no way to provide governments with information about the direction they have taken and whether they are making progress towards sustainability. So measurement is very important, and measurements requires both a set of data which is appropriate to achieve the objective of providing the right information to government, designing policies to achieve sustainability, but also measurement requires a nice methodology, an appropriate methodology, and an appropriate set of indicators to be able to identify the correct measures, the correct variables that can provide information governments need to implement policies. And activity is very important, and GGKP has been contributing by establishing a committee, a research committee, which has been working for a couple of years into the development of these measurement, of these methodologies, of the appropriate tools that could be implemented to guide governments, policymakers, but also NGOs and all those who want to participate in the process towards sustainability, including the business world, to provide all these actors with the right information to work towards sustainability. This is not the only attempt. There have been other attempts to achieve an appropriate set of indicators and measures of Sustainable Development Goals. Let me mention the one by the Sustainable Development Solution Network. We will hear in a few minutes at the end of the presentation. We will hear about what SDSN has been doing. Certainly, a more participatory approach with the involvement of different stakeholders who have been quite helpful in designing the set of indicators that can be used to measure Sustainable Development Goals. But there has been an organization, THEME, has developed a new set of indicators, a new database and a set of indicators for more than 140 countries for this kind of analysis and implementations of policy to be guided through good measurement. And the OECD as well has developed all these efforts are quite collaborative and useful to move on to make progress towards a good measurement of Sustainable Development Goals. Today we are going to present the results of this effort by GGKP, in particular the work coordinated by Tomasz Kozluk and Ulf Narloch, who are the two speakers of today's webinar. The work of the committee has been very careful. Every 2-3 months we went through a different round of interactions in order to carefully assess the work on indicators of measurement of sustainability. And after this long and careful process, we came out with a document, which is the one that will be presented today, that I believe will be very, very useful for all those attending this webinar, all those who want to learn more on the practical implementation of tools towards sustainability. The two speakers, as I said, are very, very important. Tomasz Kozluk is senior economist at OECD, has a long experience on on indicators and measurement of different policies within the OECD, and recently has been working on green growth and sustainable development policy and their own introduction into the structural reform agendas. Ulf Narloch is an economist at the World Bank. He is also an experienced economist working with the Sustainable Development Vice Presidency at the World Bank, and he works on sustainability measurement with the bank. The combination of expertise from the World Bank and the OECD is matched by the expertise of all those members of the committee, of the research committee, who have been contributing to this report. So it's now quite important to listen to the main achievements, the main output of the report, keeping in mind that the presentation will be quite short, just half an hour, and then the floor will be open for questions. Is not interactive. The webinar can be quite interactive, and questions for the audience are more than welcome, and the two presenters will reply to these answers, and I hope that the debate will be able to emphasize challenges, weaknesses, but also the positive and the achievements of this work that will be presented today. Before questions from the audience, we'll have Yves de la Mothe Karoubi from the Sustainability will start with some comments on the report. But let me stop here and give the floor to Ulf first, Ulf Narloch, for his part of the presentation. And thank you again to all of you, and thank you, Ulf, and thank Thomas for the excellent report that you produced.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. I hope everyone can hear me and we don't have any technical difficulties. So it's my pleasure to present the findings of the first phase of this research committee together with Tomasz on behalf of the research committee. It's great to see that there are actually so many people online. A little bit surprising, but also probably shows how relevant this topic is at the moment. Let me start by saying that this was really a collaborative effort with all the members in the research committee, which presents experts from different organizations with very different expertise and also very different research focuses. So this was really great to bring everyone together, and we also really identified. She did a lot of the background work of this first phase work, so she did definitely do a very important contribution. So all this started about 2 years ago. As Carlo said, there are like lots of initiatives out there that seek to measure green growth, and our objective was really to better understand how countries at the moment can measure inclusive green growth, and what are the available indicators and data out there, and the existing gaps. So this was the objective of this whole exercise. Our starting point was basically that inclusive green growth combines economic, social, and environmental dimensions. And as such, it really confronts us with a measurement challenge, as data and also indicators that bring together these three dimensions, they are really, really rare. We also all understood that there's no single indicator or a standardized one-size-fits-all approach to measure inclusive green growth, and that countries really can choose among very different measurement approaches and also different indicators, and sometimes even different data sources for the same indicator. And it was also very clear that there have been significant advances in this field in the last few years, but that there were still a few very considerable measurement gaps. So this presentation, I will quickly talk you through some of the main findings on the measurement themes and the measurement approaches that we reviewed. And then I will hand over to Tomasz, who will talk us through the more interesting part. That's what are actually the measurement gaps that remain and that we need to work on. So together with the research committee and all its members, we identified 5 themes that are of relevance for measuring progress on inclusive green growth. These are natural assets, resource efficiency and decoupling, resilience and risk, economic opportunities and efforts, and inclusiveness. And for each of them we reviewed like indicators that could be used to measure these aspects, and also the data, mainly openly available data, to get a first sense of what's actually available and how can these things be measured. So natural assets is basically about measuring the stocks of natural capital and its changes, and the flow of ecosystem services related to economic growth. And we found that there are plenty of data out there that measures the current status and changes over time. For example, on land cover, also some pollution data is out there, degradation data. But overall, that there's very limited coverage of qualitative aspects, say for example water pollution, or the economic costs and benefits associated with these natural capital stocks and flows. On resource efficiency and decoupling, that's basically to measure how efficiently or wastefully we produce economic outputs, and how economic growth is decoupled from the use of natural resources. And here we found that data is available at fairly aggregate levels for some countries, especially developed countries, but that most of all the existing data and indicators focus on the production side, and there's very little on the demand side. Risk and resilience is basically measuring how economic growth and well-being are resilient to ecological risk. And we found a great number of indicators and also indices that measure various aspects of resilience. But overall we found that, and we concluded that the truly comprehensive metrics that measure the multidimensionality of resilience are missing so far. Then economic opportunities and efforts, that came really out as a very important theme, and that's about measuring how policies facilitate green transformations and economic opportunities that are created through green policies. And we found that there are some indicators out there and some data, but that's very limited in coverage, mainly developed countries, and that overall the data and indicators remain very scarce and underdeveloped. Then inclusiveness, that also came out as a very important theme as people talk more and more not only about green growth but also about inclusive green growth. So basically we want to understand the distribution of costs and benefits of environmental policies among different social groups. And here we found that there's really a notable lack of environmental data that captures any social dimensions. There are a few advances in this area, but they are mainly single studies, and there are no databases that really captures the inclusiveness dimension of green growth. Okay, so let me quickly now go through measurement approaches. As I pointed out, inclusive green growth is really about environmental, economic, and social dimensions. So we reviewed 4 approaches that can be used to combine these 3 different dimensions. And these are and adjusted economic measures. And what we did here was basically for each of these approaches we reviewed some data, some global data that's openly accessible, but also how they are used at the country level, like countries that are advancing on green growth, how do they make use of these 4 different measurement approaches. So dashboard of indicators is basically a way to present a set of metrics. They can be a great number of metrics that are totally unrelated, and they can even be measured in different units. And what we found here is that they are most widely used, and that there are frameworks and data available for a great number of countries, but they are mostly developed countries. And I think most done in this area is based on the OECD's Green Growth Indicator Framework, which has been applied in a number of European countries, but now also recently in Latin America and the Caribbean. Then composite indices, basically a way to aggregate different metrics into one metric by scoring and rating the underlying indicators. And so far there's no index readily available that measures or that explicit to inclusive green growth, though we should say at the moment is actually that we're working on developing such an index. Just as one example, there are a couple of other efforts in this area as well. Although there's not, at the moment, there's not this inclusive green growth index that we can use, there are already a number of environmental indices that are very relevant for measuring some aspects of inclusive green growth. And probably one of the most prominent examples that has also been tested and applied in a couple of countries is Yale's Environmental Performance Index. But there are also some examples at the country level, like Bhutan with the Gross National Happiness Index. Okay, on environmental footprints, the idea is basically that we measure if current production and consumption patterns are within planetary boundaries. And here we found a couple of global examples, but they are at the moment hardly applied at a national level. They remain very complex to measure and implement, but we all concluded that they could be a very important ingredient of an inclusive green growth measurement framework if they would be further developed and applied at a country level. Okay, and then in adjusted economic measures, here the idea is basically that we correct the conventional economic metrics like GDP, savings, or wealth by valuing environmental and social aspects. And here we really found that in the last few years some really remarkable advances have been made, primarily through natural capital accounting that has been applied through TEEP, also through the WAVES, and has been applied in a number of countries. However, most of these initiatives so far and most of these efforts so far, they focus on a few aspects of natural capital. And what we conclude is that not yet we have really like a way to comprehensively measure all aspects of natural assets or environmental degradation. Okay, so that's basically from my side. Now I hand over to Tomasz to talk us through the measurement gaps that came out of this stock take.
Well, I hope you can hear me. So good afternoon on my side due to the hour difference. But I have the pleasure of presenting the remainder of the paper. So basically one of the main aims of this paper was for the research committee to reflect on what are the most important or key gaps in measurement that we would like to see filled or we would like to have more work on in the coming years so that they can feed in generally into the green growth kind of knowledge base, but also into tracking and implementing sustainable development goals. So these are the 8 gaps that were identified by the committee. I'll go through them one by one, but very briefly, you can find more details in the paper. You can also find details of how the committee got there in terms of how they come from the stock taking. First of all, 2 gaps that somehow related to the assets, and one is the economic values and stocks and flows of natural assets. So basically, the idea of how can we value the use of natural resources. And of course, this is not an easy topic because monetary valuation of many of these things where markets don't exist are extremely hard. It's extremely hard to derive the benefits. Also, the values are very context specific, but I think the one key thing is to see more progress on this, to have more general inputs of monetary values into the economic analysis would be very valuable. The second one is more on the pure qualitative dimension of natural assets. So we have, as you'll see in the paper, there's quite a lot of indicators measuring the quantity of natural assets. You know, the share of land that is covered by forests and things like that. But there's very little, in fact, on the quality of both the stocks and the flows. It's going on using new technology, new approaches to measurement. Hopefully that will give us a bit of progress, but I think that's where there's a big gap that we will be hoping to fill in the next, contribute to filling over the next years, and I think that's where I think one of the priorities would lie. Third gap that was identified by the research committee is linked to the nonlinearity of use of natural assets or the ecological thresholds. Basically, the fact that the role of natural assets is not linear, and in many economic analysis it's treated that way. Basically, what are the levels of environmental use of environmental assets that are sustainable in the longer run? Where are the tipping points for ecosystem damages or ecosystem changes that, the points of no return? What are how these things play out? Whether they are, temporal, spatial variabilities, whether they're very context specific or they're more generalized, that we can use the impacts from case studies to general effects. The fourth gap is basically we do find that there's a lot of analysis of the effect of policies, both economic and environmental, obviously, and developments, both economic and environmental, again, on economic performance, especially in this fact we were looking at the economic performance of firms. There's also quite a bit of analysis on the environmental performance, so the environmental effectiveness of policies or the impacts of various policies on what is going on with the environment. But these two things are quite separated, so it's hard to find evidence of what is going on, at the firm level or at the industry level, both economic and environmentally jointly. So the suggestion there is to look at the possibility of measuring these outcomes together, because that is what will matter for green growth. So for environmental policy, but also for general policy. But for environmental policy, what will matter most is, whether this policy has environmental impacts, whether this policy has economic impacts, and what are these impacts. And the good news, I think, is that a lot of this data, for developed countries at least, actually exists. It's sitting somewhere in the statistical offices, in the environmental agencies, other places. However, it's not very well harmonized. It's often confidential on the economic side. There's some ideas to link it. I think there's an initiative in Statistics Canada now trying to link environmental and economics data. There's various small issues, how to use this data in terms of aggregation. But I think that's a very important gap if you want to assess the effects of policies for green growth. The gap 5 is on the resilience. Basically, resilience, as we find in the paper, needs an operational definition to be able to translate the ad hoc definition into more variable measures. There's a general problem measuring resilience, because resilience is difficult to observe, right? I mean, either on the one hand, everything is fine and you seem resilient, but then disaster strikes, and there you don't really have an obvious counterfactual. So I think the key thing is to fill data gaps on risks, risk preparedness, the responsiveness, the capacity of countries or economies, regions to respond, the recovery time, things like that. The gap 6 is what Ulf mentioned already, is the opportunity side of green growth. So a lot of the green growth debate focuses on, or environmental climate debates focus on the long-term benefits of action and the short-term costs of action. Well, obviously for policymakers that want to go for policies to achieve green growth, it would be more attractive to focus on the opportunities in the short term too. There are some, but it's often elusive. They're indirect, they're difficult to assess, and they have been overplayed in the past. So I think there's a big challenge in opportunities, but also in making sure that we can distinguish the let's say the effort side or the transition dynamic sides from opportunities and costs, to be sure what we're talking about, using various definitions, which are not always easy. I mean, putting a label on what is a green job, what is not a green job, is problematic, and there's various ways of doing that, and basically that's one of the gaps that is identified. Another gap is about the impacts of environmental policies, and there it's a gap that is important for guiding policymakers on how to implement better policies, how to implement policies that actually achieve the goals they want. And that is one of the gaps there, basically, is the lack of good data on environmental policies. Not just stringency of environmental policies, but more generally, design of environmental policies, the effects of environmental policies on other things, the interaction with other policies. The final gap, last but not least, is the one on distributional effects. This is linked to the political economy of green growth. It's basically the environmental changes, who is affected by environmental policies, to what extent, how are the benefits and costs distributed across the society, across economic groups, and across time. There's certain progresses there in terms of using, say, more innovative methods of overlaying geospatial data sets, for instance, population poverty maps with environmental outcomes. There's other things going on, like the integration of environmental questions in household surveys. So there's a lot of progress, but I think we're still not there. There's still a lot of work needed on this gap. So to give you a bit of a kind of things to think about, maybe, is what happens next? What is the role of GGKP and the green growth community about these things? How can we fill in some of these gaps? How can we build more research, more information, more statistical information on these gaps? How can we use innovative data collection processing methods to fill in these gaps? And how can we use the opportunity of SDGs to put more investment into data and analytical capacity? I'll end there. Thank you very much, and I hope we have a nice discussion.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tomasz. Thank you for this presentation. Of course, you emphasize a lot of gaps and limitation of present analysis, existing analysis. Of course, we want to improve and do better. And I believe that even from this discussion that will follow, we will get ideas on how to solve some of the problems that you outlined during the presentation. But before doing that, let's move to our discussion. Thank you, Eva, for being here with us today. And I know that you have been working for a while on these issues of measurement of indicators. You've been working with the Sustainable Solution Development Network as a manager in charge exactly of the work on indicators, and the report that has been recently published by SDSN. Thank you for your comments, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Carlo. Thank you to Carlo, Ulf, and Tomasz for your presentations. I'll start maybe very briefly by giving a little bit of background about the SDSN, the work that we've done on indicators, and then rather than responding directly to some of these specific points around green growth indicators, to share some insights about the global process around the SDG indicators and where some of these opportunities might come from regarding the SDGs and this developing area of work on green growth indicators. So for those of you who are not familiar with the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, we're known as SDSN. We are an initiative of the UN Secretary General that was launched in 2012 to mobilize academia, research, and NGOs around what was then called the post-2015 agenda to provide expert inputs into this process. And now, since the adoption of the SDGs officially, our role is to get this expertise around implementation. So we published a report, as Carlo mentioned, called Indicators and a Monitoring Framework for the SDGs. This followed an 18-month expert-led work with 2 global public consultations, during which we received hundreds and hundreds of responses. So it was really a deeply consultative process. And for us, we framed thinking about the indicators as a management tool to help countries develop implementation and monitoring strategies for achieving the SDGs, and as a report card to monitor progress and ensure accountability of governments to their citizens. If you're interested in learning more about this report, the website is just indicators.report. And in it we present what we've called an integrated monitoring framework that combines the national level indicators, which we think will be the most important monitoring level for the SDGs, complemented by regional and a much smaller set of global indicators. And finally, underpinning all of that are what we call thematic indicators. So I think you can see a couple of different places where the different green growth indicators that the presenters have discussed would fit in. Obviously, there's a lot of this data that exists exists nationally, so there's a real opportunity to develop some of these indicators at the national level. And then at the global level, using sort of this thematic approach to develop complementary monitoring under the theme of green growth. Just to bring you up to speed also, we work very closely with different UN agencies and UN processes around the development of the indicator framework for the SDGs. So I'll just give a very brief update on the status. There's this group called the Interagency and Expert Group for SDG Indicators. They were mandated by the UN Statistical Commission in March 2000, so a little bit more than a year ago. This is a member state-led process, so there are 28 countries represented. These countries are actually meant to represent their regional subdivisions, and then other agencies act as observers to the process. So over the course of the year since their existence, they've had several meetings, had several consultations, and finally issued their report with their recommendations, which included a total of 241 indicators. There was some double counting on that list. A few indicators appeared more than once, so it's about 235 total. And the Statistical Commission endorsed that list. They endorsed it as a preliminary list about a month ago, in early March in New York. So that's sort of what the status of the official process. Unfortunately, if we want to take a little bit of a critical look at the outcomes of this process, I think that the list is very long, and it's limited in terms of how useful I think it will be for immediate monitoring of the SDGs. And really, we need to start measuring, tracking progress, understanding where we are, developing baselines. And based on our assessment, only about a third of the official SDG indicators are currently measurable as they are. And this is was then confirmed by the follow-up meeting of the IEAG about 3 weeks ago in Mexico, where they divided the indicators into 3 tiers, one of which is standard indicators that we have data for, that we know how to measure. And then the second and third tiers, there are a lot more questions around the methodology and data availability. And in terms of the quality of those indicators, I think there are a lot of open questions in terms of their ability to really effectively measure the goals and targets and capture what we need to capture in order to track our progress towards achieving the SDGs. Finally, I want to mention just another quick product that the SDSN is developing, which is our SDG Index. This is sort of being faced with the fact that the official indicators and monitoring are right now not adequate for countries to get started. We decided to develop an index. It's really more of a dashboard for countries for them to understand today where they stand. So we have about 60 indicators and data for 150 countries. And the idea is to have a snapshot so the countries understand where they stand, where the priorities need to be for action. And what I found quite interesting about the paper and about the presentation is that many of the gaps that Ulf and Tomasz highlighted were gaps that we also found as we were developing our SDG index. We had very stringent criteria for the indicators that we used. There had to be recent data available for 80% of countries with a population of more than 1 million. And we found that we really struggled to identify good indicators for a number of the goals. I would say notably goals 10, 11, and 12. For those of you who don't know the SDGs as well as I do all of the numbers, SDG 10 is on inequality, SDG 11 is on cities and urban issues, and SDG 12 is on sustainable consumption and production. And I think particularly SDG 12 encompasses a lot of the issues that were flagged as gaps during the presentation. I'll end my comments here just to say that I'm sort of ending on the same note as the presenters, that to me I see this as an opportunity and a call to action, really, that between the needs and interests around monitoring green growth and the needs and interests of monitoring the SDGs, there's a lot of overlap. And unfortunately that means that we share a lot of the same challenges and gaps, and I hope that those of you who are working on these issues will feel energized and mobilized to engage in research on these very important questions. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chief, for work. Presentation and that work by GGKP is a way of stimulating additional efforts to solve the problems and the gaps that have been identified by the research committee established by GGKP. SDSN is doing a good job, FEAM is doing a good job, the OECD as well, and others are working to fill the gaps, in particular in terms of data availability. And I would like to start from this issue by taking the first question. We have a lot of questions from the audience, and this is quite good. The first one comes from Ermina Soku, and it addresses exactly the issue of the database. The question is, how will the UN, OECD, World Bank plan to address the statistical capacity building needed to be able to measure SDGs on indicators? And I would like to organize the discussion by asking either Thomas or Alt to answer the questions as they come out. So who's willing to reply to this one?
I may get started. I'm not entirely sure about the UN process and how it will be decided which agencies will support building statistical capacities for certain indicators, because as far as I understand, there's also a process by it will be decided like which agency takes care of a certain indicator or target. So I'm not entirely sure about this process, but generally, I mean, I can only speak on behalf of some of the work at the World Bank. But building statistical capacities is certainly at the center of a lot of our work. I can just highlight like what we're doing in WAVES. I mean, that's in many cases like building the institutional, but then also building the technical capacities to actually collect data and analyze data. So I think there's a lot of examples of ongoing initiatives within different organizations. How this will be streamlined through the SDGs, I'm not entirely sure how that's going to work. So that's maybe a question for Yves also. I'm not sure if you have the insights into this process.
Probably some efforts to put together all the data sets that have been developed by different organizations and institutions will help, because we are duplicating a lot of efforts. We're replicating efforts to do the same things, and this is something that could be improved.
I'm happy to jump in just quickly on sort of the official process for how the different agencies will be decided. This is still a little bit up in the air. There's a little bit of tension now between member states. A lot of the more developed countries that have well-established and well-developed statistical systems are not very interested in sort of handing over all of their data to the UN. And on the flip side, you have a lot of the developing countries that frankly won't be able to provide any of this data unless they have a lot of support on building capacity from various UN agencies. It seems that right now there is a preliminary proposal for which UN agencies will be taking the lead on various goal areas, and it's my understanding that that will be more formally decided in the coming months, essentially. But the role of those agencies will be quite different for different countries. So for developing countries, they'll have more of a proactive role in terms of really working with the statistical agencies. Of course, given the limited financing that is available for UN agencies to do this work, and then for developed countries, it'll just be more of a role of data compilation, that the developed countries would prepare their package and then just send it on in the way, for example, that the OECD does today.
I have another question on a similar issue, then I'll give you the floor, Tomasz. The question is from Liba Zumbait. She's asking about the social dimension of indicators. She heard a lot about economic indicators and environmental impacts and policy reforms, but she hasn't heard anything about attempts to measure social impacts or in general the social dimension of green growth. So how do you plan to deal with this dimension of green growth and sustainability?
If I can just quickly come back to the previous question, and I'll answer your, well, I'll try to answer your question now. I mean, just on the political process, I think this is one thing, but I think on the low level, or the working level, I think there's already a lot of collaboration between, for instance, OECD, World Bank, OECD, UNEP, and other UN agencies. So I think on the kind of harmonization or extension of various indicators to non-OECD countries or developing countries, I think this is actually going on, right? I mean, there are various initiatives there that, that aside from the political process, but just really on filling in some of the gaps that are taking place. But on the social dimension, the gap number 8 was exactly about the social dimension. It was the distributional issues of, or the distributional consequences and perspective of green growth, right? So it's both the distributional issues in terms of environmental impact, so looking at, for instance, who is impacted by pollution or by environmental service, how these are distributed across the society, because not, urban population versus a rural population, low income versus middle income high income households, who is suffering the most from environmental impacts and potentially benefiting the most from getting our acts together on cleaning the environment. And the other aspect is also the social or the distributional impact of environmental policies themselves. So things like environmental taxes, which are being introduced or will be introduced to achieve some environmental objectives or environmental goals, they have consequences on those who pay these taxes, right? So the distribution of these will drive the political economy of how these things are introduced, will drive how revenues are used. So I think this is a big gap, and I think that by no means we mean to neglect this gap. Yeah, this is one of the 8 gaps that we certainly mentioned. I don't know if anybody else wants to add something.
Yeah, right, but my impression is from reading the questions that are now floating more and more on my screen, the questions are really addressing solutions more than gaps. Of course, the report emphasizes gaps, but now the audience would like to know more about solutions. How do you think we could deliver a better assessment of the social dimension of sustainability?
Well, I mean, there is, I mean, the report was about identifying gaps, but of course, I can talk about the work that I know that is going on. There's, I mean, several aspects there. There's a lot of work on indicators trying to combine the dimensions. There is empirical work on the distributional consequences of environmental taxation, of environmental policies more generally. There is some work that I have been recently made aware of on trying to combine, for instance, the mapping of pollution with the distribution of incomes across households. So you have, the postal codes for households where you can map that with the exposure to pollution daily to see which households, the high income, low income households are subject to higher pollution levels during the day. So things like that. I think the pollutions are being developed. Yeah? I mean, it's not something that can happen immediately. It requires data. It requires a good sound methodologies. But I think that's my take on that. Or Carlo, if you want to.
I'm moving to Alf with another similar questions coming from Shoa Shafa. She asks how feasible is to measure such a huge number of SDG indicators, 235 indicators, she writes. So is it something feasible, or the gaps that you identify cannot be filled?
well, let me focus this question a little bit more on the inclusive green growth aspect, and not so much on the SDGs. I mean, yeah, SDGs 230 indicators. As Yves said, some of them are from data. Some of the identified indicators can be already measured because there are data out there, and that's well known and is of high quality. But like, if I remember correctly, if you said 2/3 of the indicators are not yet measurable, so that really then poses the question: well, if you have like 150 indicators or something like that that are not yet measurable, can we fill all these gaps in the next few years? I mean, realistically, probably no. But so I guess here it's a little bit about really focusing on what are the important gaps, and maybe also focus on the quick wins. I mean, there are some quick wins where we have data that we just have to put together, and I think the social aspect is one of these quick wins. We have high resolution data on environmental variables like pollution, land degradation, forest cover. We have that, and we have data on pollution, high resolution as well. We have poverty maps and so on and so on. And putting this together, I mean, there are lots of studies that are ongoing, but I think the next step would really be putting this together in a database, coming up with some good analytics from that, good indicators that can be used and that are meaningful, and putting this in one database. I think that's a quick win. I mean, that's probably not needing too much of an effort. So focusing on these, and then, yes, certainly, I mean, if we talk about inclusive green growth, also focusing on what's really driving the agenda and what's important for the agenda. And here what comes to my mind is this whole discussion around economic opportunities from green growth. I mean, this is what has led to a lot of the discussions that are ongoing, but not yet we can make the claim that green policies are really creating jobs or something like that. So if we have such if we have gaps that leading to such important policy questions that drive the agenda, for me that's another way of prioritizing some of these gaps. But certainly if we talk about 150 indicators or everything, if we just talk about everything around green growth, yeah, we can't address everything in the next couple of years.
Juan Pablo Castaneda writes, the UN system environmental economic indicator assessment could supply a good amount of SDG indicators. How is the discussion going in terms of making this an overarching framework within statistical institutes in countries? Who wants to reply? You don't know whether there is progress towards an overarching framework, an organization which is able to collect information from national institutes. Eve, do you have anything about it?
Not specifically on the SEA framework, no.
No, not even on other attempts to gather institutes, National Statistical Institute. No. So Mike Street writes, have you considered using integrated river basin planning and biosphere reserves as natural frameworks for facilitating the measurement and green growth process?
I may just get started on this one. So I think this is, so we haven't discussed this specifically, but I think that brings us to a very important aspect, that actually at national level a lot of data is somewhere available. And so what we focused on in this study is really on data that's easily accessible, that everyone can use because it's in a global database, because it's somewhere made publicly available by a country. But of course, if you look into a lot of these countries, there's a lot of other data that can be used to measure at a national level certain aspects of inclusive green growth. And that may actually be an example where some of these countries through these plans have very relevant data that is available. But here really the issue is, or the challenge is like, okay, first of all, to identify that data. Of course, if you're a policymaker in that country, you probably know about it. But even then, if you're hired to conduct a study on that country, you not necessarily know about all these things. So first of all, being able to identify this data, and second, then also getting access to that data. That's often very difficult, and that brings us maybe to another gap or challenge that we haven't explicitly mentioned, but that is how to use existing data, especially at a national level that's not yet easily available. And I think it would be an important exercise at a national or global level, wherever the discussions are or engagement is, to bring such data together.
Thomas?
I just wanted to add one, I mean, maybe not directly answering the question, but one aspect of this question I think is particularly important. And the report focused primarily on measuring green growth at the national level, but it is an important question, is at what level you measure various aspects of green growth. I mean, some of it will be national, because that's where the policy decisions are taken, or the important policy decisions are taken. Some of it will be subnational, some of it will be actually at a regional level, some of it will be at the city level. So there's various aspects of measuring particular parts of green growth. The other thing is how you present data. I mean, I know a recent experience that we had on measuring air pollution. Basically, you have various places which report average air pollution across the country, which is basically quite a meaningless variable. But another way to show it is, for instance, using the satellite images on air pollution figures, merging that together with where people live, and basically looking at how many people in the country are exposed to harmful levels of air pollution. Yeah, and that actually has a meaning. That has the actual meaning. So there's various ways or innovations in how to present data that is actually available and out there that can be very useful for guiding policymakers. Thank you.
I have a couple of questions from Adriana Flores. The first one is about participation, and Eve mentioned a little bit the participatory process in developing indicators, and she says that NGOs have a lot of problems to be included in global participation in real terms, in particular on SDGs. What do you think about, Eve, what do you think about this issue of involving the NGOs?
Yeah, I mean, I think particularly around the SDG indicator process, there was a seemingly open consultation, led by this official UN process, but ultimately it was very unclear how any of the comments received were processed, taken into account, and ultimately influenced the list. I think there was a lot of pushback on many of the indicators by big coalitions of civil society, and we weren't able to get any traction or changes. So this has been really challenging. But I think moving forward, now that we have the indicators categorized into these 3 tiers, and there are work plans being developed around the 2nd and 3rd tiers, so the ones that are not, where we don't have good data or agreements on methodology. This is really where there's an opportunity for civil society, NGOs, academia, other research. And I think, realistically, that we cannot have this long list of 235 indicators will absolutely not be measurable unless there is broad mobilization. It's not the UN and it's not the national statistical systems that are going to come up with these new indicators or these new measurement frameworks. And so this is exactly the type of community that needs to be mobilized. And I do think that moving forward it will be easier, and there will be more opportunities for different specialized groups, especially once the lead agency per goal, or agencies, I should say, because in many cases it'll be 2 or 3 agencies sharing the burden. That's really where there's an opportunity for technical work. Unfortunately, I think the process up until now was highly politicized, and that's why a lot of the important technical aspects were ignored. But moving forward, I think there will be an opportunity, I hope.
Thank you. The second question, so the second Adriana's question is about GAP 5. GAP 5 is about resilience on socioeconomic system to ecological shock. But what about economic shocks? Is there a gap, or why is it not there?
Good, well, very good point. I think what we wanted to focus on here in the context of inclusive green growth is some environmental dimensions. And of course you can see it from two different ways. The environment as where the shock comes from, so best example is climate shocks or natural disasters, but also we can talk about environmental pollution, for example, as shock. The other one is where the environment is actually part of building resilience, like a healthy, functioning ecosystem. So we could see it from these two sides. And probably that's where we understood it, or how we understood it. We stress the ecological shocks as well, as just a way to highlight the green, one of the green dimensions of this research theme. But of course, I mean, I think in many cases what builds resilience to an ecological shock, be it a natural disaster, be it some pollution or degradation, in many cases that's the same that also builds resilience to an economic shock, like say a price shock. And you could even argue that some of these ecological shocks, they're only affecting households through economic, like, yeah, you have the climate shock, you have water stress, so people not necessarily are directly affected through the water stress, but by increasing food prices, for example. So I think in many cases we're actually talking about the same. So that also means that, yeah, we're having kind of the same, I would personally say at least, we have kind of the same measurement challenges or measurement gaps to measure resilience to economic shocks.
Thank you. Thomas, would you like to add something?
I wanted to add, I mean, I think we focus particularly on the resilience to environmental shocks because, like, for instance, in the OECD, there is a big strand of work on resilience to economic shocks, which I think was recently published or is just about to be published. So I think the focus here was really not, you know, financial market shocks or labor market shocks, but really on the particular shocks coming from environmental or natural degradation. That's it for me.
Okay, I have a couple of questions by Ainsley Lloyd, but probably quite related. The first one is about you and GGKP, whether GGKP is planning to get involved and to work on the implementation on solutions to fill some of these gaps that you described. But the second, probably more interesting question is about whether you have been seeing anything particularly exciting recently happening for any of these gaps, to address any of these gaps. So again, the audience is asking for solutions. Did you see anything exciting, some recent work on these gaps? Thomas, and then Al?
I can just add my small bit. I think for the GGKP itself, this it's not really the role of GGKP to fill in these gaps. It's a place where it's a knowledge platform where, you know, various organizations like FEMA, SDSN, World Bank, OECD, UNEP, others come together and discuss these things and try to get these things implemented. But they're not implemented in the GGKP itself. I think that would be too much to ask for from the GGKP. It's more the value of the dialogue and the sharing of the knowledge that is provided by the GGKP. On various exciting things, I think it's one thing I mentioned, maybe not well enough. For instance, on GAP, I think it was GAP 4, on combining the economic and environmental impacts at the micro level. I know that there's work going on between Statistics Canada and Environment Canada on basically they have actually done the work partly on merging microdata from manufacturing surveys with basically the national pollutant release and national pollutant release inventory, which basically gives you at the firm level, you know, or the plant level, the economic developments of the firm and the plant, and the pollution that is generated at that level. There's also, I think, links to or attempts to link that with tax data at the firm level, so you can have even more on profits on how the firm is doing in terms of economic performance. It's something that, you know, if that could be done across many more countries, I think that would be extremely valuable for economic analysis. So I think that's something that excites me, at least, in this respect. I mean, probably there's many other things, but I think that was the example I wanted to make.
Alf?
Yeah, so perhaps two examples of what I find highly exciting and what I see as great advances. There are many more than just these two. But so first of all, that more and more high-resolution data on environmental variables is becoming available. I think this, for someone who has, for people who have worked in this field for many, many years, I mean that's really a novel. That's really novel, and that's really pushing us into a whole new area where we can do a lot of new research, because these data hasn't been available at such a resolution level so far, and it's really allowing a lot of new analysis and allowing us to develop new indicators and so on. So I think this is really a great advance, and probably also to be very honest, where we have a little bit of advantage over some of the other more conventional areas, like people working on economic well-being only. I mean, this really requires household surveys. They are really cumbersome and really costly to do. We, in many cases, can rely on some satellite data. So I think that's a big advance. And there are more and more satellites up and running that can be used for very specific purposes. So I think this will really push the boundaries that we are talking about. The other one is, I think this will still take a little bit of time till we really see the results of that, but that more and more household surveys, living standard measurement initiatives, they take into account some set of environmental variables. So for just one example, there has been a forest module that has been developed for the living standard measurement surveys, and that has been now piloted and hopefully will be implemented in a few countries. So again, this is something where a whole new set of data will become available, and that will allow us at a country level, at least for the countries where we're doing these kind of surveys, which will allow us to come up with new analytical work, but also to develop new indicators. So I think these are a couple of really interesting advances. But then also the whole work on natural capital accounting, I think this is really has picked up in the last few years, and this is helping us a lot to when we're talking about inclusive green growth.
Yves, did you see something exciting about these gaps or ways of addressing the gaps?
I mean, I think in general, there has been a lot of excitement around the opportunities of big data, the data revolution, these sorts of things. SDSN has been one of the founding coalition measure of the Global Partnership on Sustainable Development Data. And I think there are a lot of exciting initiatives coming out of that work, though it's not specifically on green growth. Most of it is related to SDG indicators.
Thank you. Next question from John Okebole, and again, he wants case studies or samples of where proposed indicators of green growth have been used. Do you have any example, any suggestions on how or where you can find applications?
Could you repeat the question? I didn't.
You would like to have some case study or some samples of where proposed indicators have been used.
Okay. I think, I mean, basically, if I understand the question correctly, I think in the paper you can actually find quite a lot of examples, both at the country level or at the cross-country level, where indicators are applied or tested to see, where the gaps are, how the countries are doing. Individual countries applying either their own frameworks or their own indicators. There's the World Bank basically with, I don't know, coverage of a huge amount of countries in terms of the adjusted net savings. There's the OECD indicators, which cover quite a few countries, mainly developed but also developing, and have been applied to also, as mentioned by Ulf, to Latin American countries and several others. So I think if that's the question, then I think in the paper you can find actually quite a lot of examples of these. Maybe I'm not getting the question correctly, though.
Okay, next one is on Charlotte Karibuhoye. She again asks about governance. Educational process on green economy or green growth. How will the UN lead the process and to ensure there is relevant dialogue and synergy among the agencies? Who would like to answer?
I mean, I can speak a little bit to our experiences in countries. SDSN has more than 25 national and regional networks around the world working with member states on SDG implementation. And I think anybody at the UN would say that, of course, you defer to the member state in terms of how they want to organize themselves. I, for example, work mostly in sub-Saharan Africa, where they already have a lot of familiarity with the MDG process, and so they have a well-established sort of ecosystem, usually led by a Ministry of Finance or Planning, and now they're sort of thinking through how to partner more closely, for example, with the Ministry of the Environment, in sort of bringing these different teams together to work on the SDGs. But I don't think you'll have any kind of prescription from the UN in terms of how countries should organize themselves.
Let's move to the next question by Mike Babenko from WWF in Russia, and he's asking about how to get non-OECD countries more involved in the process. So he asks whether the engagement of new development bank, the BRICS Bank or the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank in green growth and measuring green growth can be useful, and how it can be achieved. Well, what do you think?
Well, maybe I get started from the World Bank perspective a little bit. I mean, I think there's actually already a increasing excitement about green growth in many, many countries. We have a few projects in America where, well, it's really demand-driven. It's coming from the countries. So I wouldn't say that this is not of interest for developing countries. I actually think it is of increasing interest of these countries, and that's what we are feeling in the demand for analytical work in this area, but also in terms of lending operations. In terms of analytical work on measurement, yes. I mean, probably if you look for data, you will find out very quickly that the best data out there is, or like the most comprehensive data out there is coming from the OECD database. That's certainly also has to do a little bit with the data gaps that generally exist in developing countries. I mean, we are facing in many cases contexts in which there are weak statistical capacities. Data may exist, but it's hard to put it together, or it may not even exist. So I think that's generally a problem for developing countries, and that's where, coming back to the very first question, where we really have to invest in building statistical capacities to collect such data and to analyze this data and make it available.
Tomasz, would you like to ask something on the role of the banks, in particular the new banks that have been emerging?
Well, I mean, the role so far, I don't think I have much to say, but I think potentially, yes, there is an important role. Yeah. So in terms of experience, I cannot say much because I think a lot of these banks are still in the process of establishing themselves. So I don't think I can add much on that, but potentially, you know. So.
Potentially, yes. Question by Johannes Kleinberg, and could you comment briefly on how your research is related to the ongoing discussion of increasing policy coherence across sectors, in particular the water-energy nexus? Alf?
Yeah, well, maybe I don't have a perfect answer to that, because that's a challenging topic. I mean, the interactions between different sectors, and I think that's also, I don't think we have much of the data so far to really measure these interactions. So I think that's really a research gap that, yeah, we haven't pointed that out as in the paper, but that's, I would say, yeah, it is another gap that's worthwhile to address. And I think it's an important one because there's certainly trade-offs between different sectors. So it's a very important area which we haven't really addressed, but it's worthwhile to look into that.
Certainly a good set of indicators can help assessing possible inconsistency across different policies. So if you are able to analyze impact of policy on indicators, if indicators just provide a snapshot on the past, of course this is not really useful. But if indicators are, for example, integrated into a model of the global economy, and you are able to simulate impacts of policies on different indicators, then you can identify possible inconsistency or ways in which one policy can positively affect one indicator and negatively affect other ones, and vice versa.
Yeah.
Thomas.
I mean, if I can, I think that's one of the key aspects of what the dashboard indicators try to look at. You have many dimensions of what we call green growth or inclusive green growth, and basically an integrated look at what is going on in the dimension that you're interested. I think that's basically the way to try to deal with the energy water nexus or many other nexuses that might be present in the green growth framework.
Yeah, we should probably try to move away from a backward-looking perspective, so not just using indicators to look at the past performance of countries, but try to use indicators to predict the future performance of different policy implementations. That would be useful. Let me move to a subtle question by Christiane Derani, and she's asking whether the findings brought by Ulf and the gas presented by Tomasz are related to green economy, and the question is how far a green economy can be considered from a green growth. So is green economy a synonym of a green growth, or is it different?
I think, I mean, if I can start, at least Wolf can probably add, or you can add some things. I think in the report we kind of take an approach that, whether you call it green growth, green economy, inclusive green growth, sustainable green growth, many of the others, in most cases we're talking about the same thing. We're talking about the same objective of sustainable, environmentally sustainable growth that that preserves the natural assets for future generations. So,
okay, fully agree. Nafise Jafarzadeh is asking about accountability. How to inject accountability mechanism in SDGs with considering its not legally binding and voluntary nature? How do you reply? This is more a policy question, so maybe Eve would like to say something about whether we can consider countries accountable if these objectives, these goals are not achieved.
That's an excellent question, and I think in many cases you did have a high-level commitment, but of course the nature of these commitments for anything that's in the longer term, this goes beyond the current governments that are usually in place. That's sort of the power of them, but also the risk that you take. If you have a change of government that's not interested in implementing these goals, ultimately this is not a binding. This is not any kind of international contract between nations. This is a fully voluntary process. So there's no sort of punishment mechanism if countries fail to achieve the goals.
We have a question by Peter Rowan. He says the SDSN network and other networks are limited to university scientists, etc., but not to professional experts in the private sector, where a lot of this work is done. So is there any way, any idea, any proposal to engage this large group of experts and people in a sustainable way to work on developing a coherent and an applicable approach?
I think that one's for me too. Just to answer very quickly that we do work very closely with the private sector. Private sector companies can't be members officially of the SDSN, but I would say on a project-by-project basis and on the national and regional levels, we do engage very closely with the private sector. So there are lots of existing opportunities.
And Amsalu Woldi-Yalev asked whether there are guidelines that could help countries to harmonize and to deliver better and harmonized data sets. Is there anything like that around? All for Tomasz know about preparation of guidelines to prepare to data sets for indicators?
I wouldn't know. I believe that, like, as part of some of the ongoing initiatives that really try to build statistical capacities, just again as an example, rates, that something like that is actually prepared for specific countries. But I wouldn't be able to point you at specific examples. I mean, I can find out, but I don't have them ready here.
This could be another gap to be filled. I mean, the UN could prepare some guidelines for this kind, or is there a committee which is working on this kind of guidelines?
Yeah, I mean, what I would have specific examples, but one of the big discussion points on the SDG indicators is this question of harmonization. You need to have comparable data. You need to have data that can be combined also to create these global averages. So there's very detailed metadata and methodology for every single one of the SDG indicators. So in some cases, this is already known. This is already well developed. You know, on poverty metrics, on many of the health metrics, this is already done and centrally coordinated. And then for other indicators, this is the ongoing work essentially.
We have another question from Christian Durani. Have you considered national regulation driving economic practices and policy and the analysis of compliance as a possible indicator?
Sorry. Yeah, well, Tomasz, I think you may be in a better position to answer that one. Yeah, I would say, yeah, that's part of what's captured in the whole area, what we call economic opportunities and efforts, but there's very little data that's out there. So we consider that, but we haven't found much data that can be used to come up with some statistics or indicators for that.
Tomasz,
I'm sorry, I was trying to, I didn't hear basically what you guys were talking about. I had some technical.
She's asking about national regulation driving economic practices and policies and the analysis of compliance and whether this could be a possible indicator.
Yeah, compliance is to be honest, I'm not sure how to answer the question. I mean, it could be a possible indicator, but what exactly would one want to measure? The national regulation driving compliance or the actual compliance? I think the compliance, yes, that's certainly an indicator, but
probably you want to measure the progress towards sustainability, and compliance with respect to existing laws and regulation is certainly an indicator on how quickly or whether you are going to move towards sustainability. It's easy to say to deliver a law, to approve a law in a parliament, and then compliance is a different matter in many countries. So an indicator of this kind could be useful to assess progress towards sustainability.
Yeah, and I think actually most environmental agency, for instance, would be concerned with the compliance, right? And they would be monitoring compliance in various ways. So some of this data, I'm sure it exists. It's more maybe a question of harmonizing, bringing it together, and interpreting it correctly. But yes, I mean that is certainly a possible indicator. So on the, you know, whether the policies on paper are actually transmitted to real life. That's the.
Another question from William Scott. The increasing push to incorporate sustainability aspects throughout all parts of the economy can further challenge separating environmental and economic information for measurement. For example, how to effectively monitor and report on green jobs in diverse industries and roles. How would you propose to address this challenge? What are some best practices we have seen internationally? Do you have any? It's a long and.
I'm not sure if I understand that question correctly. Can you perhaps repeat the second part?
The second part is whether you would like to address this challenge of this challenge is the separation between environmental and economic information for measurement.
Oh, okay. Well, I think that's mainly a an analytical challenge where we have, well, I'm sorry, I may really not answer, like, I'm not sure if I really understand the question, but so if it's about like data coming from, we have environmental data and we have economic data, how to bring the two together. So I think here it's really, I mean, in the first instance, a data analysis, so it's an analytical challenge. Like, how do we put this together in a meaningful way? Like Tomasz brought the air pollution example. So just to calculate a national average may not always be very meaningful, but then look, like just saying like what is the average level of air pollution, but then looking into like how many people actually live in areas that are above critical thresholds. So the first question is really how to bring such data together and then build an indicator based on such an analytical effort and then make this indicator available. But again, sorry, I'm not sure if I understood this question correctly.
Fine, we don't have to have an answer to really many questions, and we're receiving to answer all of them. I have another one from, there are still many, I don't know whether we'll be able to answer all of them, but there is another one by Stefan Rosenow, and he says that he remembers the network of networks for impact evaluation, and as there are similar indicators to be measured in SDGs, environmental footprint, climate change footprint, and so on, is there a network of these indicators already on the way? So whether there is a network of institutions that are going to work on SDGs indicators in the same way which there are networks on environmental footprint or climate change footprints, and this is what he's asking. Probably again the same question: is there any way of coordinating the efforts on gathering data and measuring sustainability?
Just to jump in on my experience, I think there's two ways this is currently happening. One way is via the UN agency that is responsible for coordination of the monitoring of certain goal areas. So for example, on the urban goal, UN Habitat will probably be coordinating some different working groups, thinking through areas where urban indicators need to be developed. And then conversely, you have sort of more bottom-up movements where different organizations together without a formal mandate to work on these things. So these are sort of two experiences that I've had.
And Mike Street is asking about green GDP. Many countries are experimenting with green GDP. Any idea who is making most progress?
I don't think one can say who's making most progress. I mean, I think most interestingly, some of these measures already, well advanced. It's maybe too much to say, but pretty much advanced in some of the like European countries. But then I think what's really interesting in some of the developing countries where such measures are also increasingly applied through natural capital accounting, for example. So I don't think one can say who's making most progress, but I think there are certainly a few interesting examples, countries, the Philippines, Botswana, just a couple that I can name out of my head, where some really interesting applications can be found.
Tomasz, do you have anything?
I mean, personally, I'm not maybe a big fan of green GDP, but as an indicator, I'm more kind of dashboard approach. But I think that the issue of green GDP is very much linked to some of the gaps that we identify, in particular the gap 1 and 2, but not only. It's on the question of valuation of environmental stocks and flows, and giving things that don't normally have a market value, an appropriate value, valuing their quality, and finding the thresholds where these valuations change. So I think it's a very vital question, and I think a lot of this work on this green GDP would benefit from some progress on these gaps that we have. I think that's my take on that.
We have one last question because time is almost over, from Niels Ausdenmoor from Berlin. He's working with the Leibniz Institute in Berlin, as he's asking, how far is the need for a database that may serve as the basis of causal impact evaluation is taken into account in the current work of setting up a SDG indicator framework. So he's asking whether we can assess the causes of the problems or the improvements in terms of sustainability rather than just describing sustainability.
I would say that's another challenge. I mean, most of what we are having available is on monitoring like the status of, say, environmental variables or some economic variables. What's really, and we find a lot of gaps there already. What's really driving a change in these variables is then another question. Of course, to answer that question, we first need better data on to understand what's the current status. So I think this is another gap, and then a question that comes up more and more. Just one brief example is like where we overlay data, where we overlay maps on, say, forest cover or other environmental variables with socioeconomic status, say poverty. So I mean, this is already important to know if more poor people live in environmentally stressed areas or not. But what are the causal linkages? I think that's another question, which we haven't really, which is another question and a research gap that really needs to be addressed.
Tomasz?
I think this is precisely what Gap 7 is about. It's the impact of environmental policy, but it's a bit broader than that. It's a bit of the impact of environmental policies, economic conditions, and the interaction between these things, social policies also. So basically about establishing causal links between the policy side and the state of the world and what is going on in terms of the economic and environmental, and particularly environmental impacts. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. The webinar is over. It's 5:30 sharp, at least here in Europe. Thank you all. In particular, thank you to the two speakers, both Tomasz and Al, for the excellent presentation, and in particular the many answers to the many questions. I'm very grateful to Eve for the comments, but also to the audience. We had really a lot of participants, active participants, a lot of questions. I realized that not all questions were successfully addressed, not because of the lack of information by Ulf and Tomasz, but because they were difficult questions addressing topics and elements of the problem that have something to do with solutions more than with gaps and challenges. And solutions are quite difficult, and in particular for the big effort, the big challenge of measuring sustainability and guiding the process, the policy process towards sustainability. It's a difficult one, and I think that with the support of all the institutions involved in the GGKP and all those who are attending and participating in this seminar, I think we will be able to make progress, and I believe that the GGKP Research Committee will make further progress in identifying solutions to the gaps and challenges that this first report has identified. Thank you all, thank you very much, and see you next webinar.
Thank you, Carlo. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, bye-bye.
Thank you, bye.